When we speak of the empath, we are not describing a personality type in the casual sense, but a particular orientation of consciousness. The empath is a person whose psyche is naturally permeable, whose emotional boundaries are thin, not because they are weak, but because they are receptive. They feel before they think, sense before they analyze, and absorb the emotional climate of a room the way lungs absorb air. Psychology has long noted that such individuals often develop early, not chronologically but inwardly. They learn to read moods, anticipate shifts, and adapt themselves in order to maintain relational harmony. This capacity, once necessary for survival, later becomes both their greatest gift and their deepest wound. For much of their life, the empath may appear to be losing. They give too much, stay too long, forgive too easily, and doubt themselves too deeply. They often find themselves entangled with personalities that are loud, dominant, or emotionally unavailable. From the outside, it can look like a pattern of self-sabotage, but depth psychology offers a different interpretation. The psyche does not repeat patterns randomly. It repeats them in search of resolution. The empath's early environment taught them that connection required attunement, self-erasure, and emotional labor. Until this lesson is brought into consciousness, the psyche will recreate it again and again, hoping for a different ending. In analytical psychology, there is a concept of the shadow, the parts of the self that are denied, repressed, or undeveloped because they were not safe to express. For the empath, the shadow often contains qualities like anger, assertiveness, self-interest, and power. These traits were not encouraged. They were often punished or ignored, so they were buried. Yet what is buried does not disappear. It waits. And the return of the shadow is not gentle. It arrives as exhaustion, resentment, depression, or a sudden sense that one's life no longer fits. The empath's comeback does not begin with external success. It begins with an inner refusal, a quiet but irreversible moment when the psyche says, "This cannot continue." In psychological terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person separates from collective expectations and unconscious patterns to become an integrated self. This process is rarely celebrated at first. It often looks like withdrawal, confusion, or collapse. The empath may lose relationships, roles, or identities that once defined them, but what is dissolving is not their essence, it is their adaptation. Other psychologists have written about similar phenomena. One theorist of psychosocial development described how unresolved stages of identity result in role confusion and stagnation later in life. Another, writing on self-actualization, observed that individuals who are highly sensitive to others' needs often delay their own growth until a crisis forces reorientation. The empath's crisis is not a failure, it is a summons. Spiritually, this moment has been described across traditions as a dark night, a descent, or an initiation. It is the phase where the old self no longer works, but the new self has not yet emerged. The empath may feel stripped of certainty, disconnected from meaning, and unusually alone. Yet psychology reminds us that solitude is not the same as isolation. Solitude is where unconscious material surfaces. It is where the psyche, no longer distracted by external demands, begins to speak in symbols, dreams, and bodily signals. During this period, the empath often confronts a painful realization. Much of their so-called kindness was intertwined with fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish or unlovable. This realization can feel devastating because it threatens their moral self-image. But depth psychology insists that true morality begins only after illusion falls away. Compassion that arises from fear is not freedom, it is strategy. Compassion that arises from wholeness is power. The empath's sensitivity, once a liability, begins to reorganize itself. They no longer feel everything indiscriminately. Instead, discernment develops. They begin to notice how different environments affect their nervous system. They recognize which relationships drain them and which ones restore them. Neuroscience supports this shift. As self-awareness increases, the brain's threat detection systems become less reactive, and emotional regulation improves. What once overwhelmed now informs. There is also a profound shift in the empath's relationship to boundaries. In early life, boundaries may have felt dangerous, equated with rejection or abandonment. Now boundaries become sacred, not walls but membranes, structures that allow exchange without collapse. Psychology defines this as differentiation, the ability to remain connected to others without losing oneself. For the empath, differentiation is revolutionary. It marks the end of unconscious self-sacrifice. In writings on archetypes, there is the figure of the wounded healer, one who gains the capacity to guide others precisely because they have confronted their own suffering. The empath often embodies this archetype unconsciously for years, healing others while neglecting themselves. The comeback begins when the healer turns inward, when they stop bypassing their pain with service and finally listen to what it has been asking for all along. This inward turn is not selfishness, it is integration. Other psychologists have emphasized that the self cannot be sustainably generous if it is internally fragmented. Burnout, a term popularized in modern psychology, is not merely exhaustion, it is the psyche's protest against chronic self-betrayal. The empath's burnout is the signal that their old way of being has reached its limit. As this inner reorganization unfolds, the empath may feel anger rising, sometimes suddenly, sometimes intensely. This anger is not a regression, it is a return. It is the reemergence of a vital force that was suppressed for the sake of belonging. Depth psychology views anger not as a problem to be eliminated, but as energy that demands conscious direction. When owned rather than projected, it becomes clarity, decisiveness, and self-protection. Spiritually, anger has often been misunderstood as unholy or destructive, yet many contemplative traditions recognize a fierce compassion, a force that cuts through illusion and refuses harm. The empath's anger, once rated, serves this function. It guards the soul. It says no where silence once reigned. The comeback also involves a redefinition of love. The empath begins to see that love without reciprocity is not love, it is longing. Love without respect is not virtue, it is erasure. Psychologists who studied mature love identified components such as care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. For years, the empath may have emphasized care while neglecting respect for self. The rebalancing of these elements marks a profound psychological shift. Externally, this transformation may look quiet. The empath may step back from social roles, speak less, choose carefully. But internally, something formidable is forming. The psyche is consolidating, the shadow is being integrated. The self is becoming less reactive and more rooted. Decisions are no longer made to maintain harmony at any cost, but to maintain integrity. There is often a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable, when the empath realizes they are no longer afraid of being alone. This does not mean they no longer desire connection. It means that connection is no longer the price of survival. Psychology recognizes this as a transition from anxious attachment to earned security. Earned because it was not given, it was built through inner work. As this security develops, the empath's presence changes. They are still sensitive, but no longer porous, still compassionate, but no longer self-abandoning. Others feel this shift immediately. Some are drawn to it, others resist it. Relationships that were built on imbalance begin to strain or dissolve. This is not loss, it is reorganization. Systems resist change, but they can stop it. The empath's comeback is therefore not about becoming harder. It is about becoming whole. Wholeness includes softness and strength, empathy and assertion, receptivity and choice. Depth psychology consistently emphasizes that the goal of development is not purity, but integration. A one-sided personality is fragile. An integrated one is resilient. Spiritually, this phase is often accompanied by a renewed sense of meaning, not borrowed from others, but discovered internally. Meaning, as one existential psychologist wrote, is not something we invent arbitrarily, it is something we uncover through responsibility to our own potential. The empath begins to sense that their sensitivity has a purpose beyond self-sacrifice. It is a way of perceiving truth, of noticing what others overlook, of naming what remains unspoken. As the inner and outer worlds realign, the empath may feel as though life is responding differently. Opportunities appear where none existed. People meet them with more respect. This is not magic, it is congruence. When inner boundaries solidify, external reality adjusts. Psychology supports this observation. Behavior shaped by self-respect elicits different responses than behavior shaped by fear. Yet the comeback is not linear. There are days of doubt, moments of grief for the old self, flashes of guilt when choosing oneself feels unfamiliar. These are echoes, not signs of failure. The psyche does not discard old patterns instantly, it loosens them gradually. Awareness accelerates this process, but patience sustains it. The empath's greatest challenge during this time is not regression, but temptation. The temptation to return to what is familiar, to rescue, to overgive, to disappear into others' needs. Each temptation is a test of integration. Each time the empath chooses themselves without cruelty, they reinforce the new structure of the self. In this phase, intuition sharpens, not the anxious intuition born of hypervigilance, but a grounded knowing that arises from alignment between mind, body, and emotion. Psychology refers to this as coherence. Decisions feel cleaner, regret lessens. The empath no longer needs to justify their boundaries, they feel them. And as this internal coherence deepens, something unmistakable begins to radiate outward. Not dominance, not superiority, but quiet authority. The authority of someone who has faced their inner chaos and survived. The authority of someone who no longer confuses endurance with virtue. The authority of someone whose empathy now flows through strength rather than depletion. This is why the empath's comeback is often misunderstood. It does not arrive with noise or revenge or dramatic declarations. It arrives as calm, as selectivity, as a refusal to explain oneself endlessly, as a life that finally feels inhabitable from the inside. And this state, once reached, continues to unfold, revealing deeper layers of power, clarity, and purpose. As the psyche keeps integrating what was once split, reclaiming what was once disowned, and moving steadily forward into a form of wholeness that is not yet finished, not yet complete, but undeniably underway, still shaping itself, still shedding old skins, still learning how to hold empathy and sovereignty in the same breath. As the transformation continues without pause, without finality, and without reaching its last word, decay, the psyche does not stop evolving. Once awareness is achieved, awareness merely opens the door to responsibility. The empath now stands at a different threshold than before. Earlier thresholds demanded endurance. This one demands choice. Choice is far more unsettling for the empath than suffering ever was, because suffering was familiar, even meaningful. Choice requires ownership. It removes the comforting narrative of inevitability and replaces it with agency. And agency, for someone who learned early to survive by adapting, can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground. In psychological terms, this phase marks the shift from identification with the wound to relationship with it. For years, the empath may have unconsciously organized their identity around being the one who understands, forgives, and absorbs. That identity brought validation, even admiration, but it also kept the deeper self hidden. Now, as integration progresses, the empath begins to sense that they are more than their sensitivity. Sensitivity is no longer who they are, it is something they have. This distinction is subtle, yet it changes everything. As this realization deepens, old emotional reflexes begin to weaken. The automatic urge to fix others softens. The compulsion to explain oneself dissolves. The empath notices pauses where reactions used to be. These pauses are not emptiness, they are space, and space is where freedom lives. Neuroscience aligns with this observation, noting that increased self-regulation correlates with greater activity in brain regions associated with reflective awareness rather than impulsive response. Spiritually, space has always been revered. It is the silence between breaths, the stillness beneath thought, the witness behind emotion. The empath, once flooded by sensation, now discovers that they can feel deeply without drowning. This is not numbness, it is containment. Containment allows depth to become wisdom rather than overwhelm. With containment comes discernment. The empath starts to recognize emotional signals not as commands, but as information. Sadness no longer automatically means responsibility. Anger no longer automatically means danger. Joy no longer requires justification. Psychology emphasizes that emotional maturity is not the absence of emotion, but the ability to interpret it accurately. The empath's inner world becomes less chaotic and more intelligible. This intelligibility brings grief. Grief for the years spent overextending. Grief for the self that believed love had to be earned through suffering. Grief for relationships that could not meet the new standard of reciprocity. This grief can be sharp, because it is intertwined with compassion. The empath does not suddenly lose understanding for others, they simply include themselves in that understanding. Grief, in this context, is not regression. It is mourning the end of an era. Psychological literature consistently shows that transitions toward health often involve grief. One must grieve the old defenses before relinquishing them. For the empath, those defenses were relational strategies that once ensured connection. Letting them go can feel like stepping into emotional nakedness. Yet this nakedness is not exposure, it is authenticity. As authenticity grows, so does intolerance for false harmony. The empath becomes less willing to maintain peace at the expense of truth. This does not make them cruel or confrontational, it makes them honest. Honest silence replaces appeasing speech. Honest distance replaces forced closeness. Honesty, in depth psychology, is not a moral posture, but a psychological necessity for integration. This shift often alters the empath's relationship to time. Urgency fades. The need for immediate resolution lessens. The empath no longer chases closure from others because they have learned to generate it internally. This does not mean they accept ambiguity indefinitely. It means they are no longer defined by it. Time becomes an ally rather than an enemy. There is also a noticeable change in the empath's somatic experience. The body begins to relax in ways it never fully did before. Chronic tension eases, sleep deepens. The nervous system, long accustomed to vigilance, learns safety from within. Somatic psychology recognizes this as the recalibration of the autonomic nervous system, shifting from chronic activation to flexible responsiveness. The empath's body finally receives the message that it is no longer alone in protecting itself. With this bodily shift comes confidence, though not the loud kind. It is a grounded confidence that does not seek confirmation. Others sense it immediately. Some feel comforted by it. Others feel unsettled. Those who benefited from the empath's previous self-erasure may react with confusion or resistance. Psychology calls this system pushback. When one element in a relational system changes, the system attempts to restore the old balance. The empath's task is not to argue with this resistance, but to remain steady. Steadiness is the hallmark of this comeback, not perfectio, not constant strength, but steadiness. The empath still feels deeply, they still care, but their care is no longer indiscriminate. It is intentional. They choose where to invest emotional energy. This choice is an act of self-respect, not selfishness. At this stage, the empath may notice a reorientation toward creativity, meaning, or vocation. Sensitivity, once spent on managing others' emotions, becomes available for expression. Many empaths discover or rediscover art, writing, teaching, healing professions, or contemplative practices. Psychology recognizes creativity as a channel for integration, allowing unconscious material to be symbolized rather than enacted. What was once lived unconsciously is now shaped consciously. Spiritually, this can feel like a calling rather than an ambition. The empath senses that their experiences were not random but formative. Suffering, once meaningless, begins to reorganize into insight. This does not justify the pain, but it contextualizes it. Meaning emerges not as consolation, but as coherence. The empath's intuition also matures. Earlier, intuition may have been entangled with anxiety, hyper-awareness mistaken for insight. Now intuition feels quieter, slower, more grounded. It arises from alignment rather than fear. Psychology distinguishes between intuition driven by threat detection and intuition informed by integrated experience. The empath learns the difference through lived practice. As this inner authority strengthens, decision-making becomes less fraught. The empath no longer agonizes endlessly over choices. They listen inwardly, notice resonance or resistance, and act. Mistakes still happen, but they are metabolized rather than internalized as proof of unworthiness. This resilience marks a significant psychological milestone. Relationships formed during this phase feel different. There is more mutual recognition, less intensity born of imbalance. The empath may initially find these relationships unfamiliar, even boring, because drama once masqueraded as depth. Over time, they recognize the quiet nourishment of stability. Psychological research supports this adjustment period, noting that individuals transitioning from insecure to secure attachment often misinterpret calm as lack of chemistry before recalibrating their expectations. There is also an ethical maturation that accompanies the empath's comeback. Ethics here does not mean rigid rules, it means alignment between values and behavior. The empath becomes more careful with their words, their promises, their availability. They no longer overcommit to avoid disappointment. They learn that integrity includes knowing one's limits. In spiritual language, this phase is often described as embodiment. Insights that once lived in thought now live in action. Compassion is no longer an abstract ideal, it is a lived balance between self and other. The empath's presence becomes medicine, not because they give endlessly, but because they are whole. At times, the empath may feel a strange nostalgia for the old self, the one who was needed everywhere, who felt indispensable. Letting go of indispensability can feel like losing significance. Psychology gently reframes this. Being needed is not the same as being valued. The empath begins to experience value that does not depend on exhaustion. This recalibration takes time. As the comeback unfolds, setbacks may occur. Old triggers resurface. Familiar dynamics reappear in new forms. These are not signs of failure, but of depth. Each layer integrated reveals another beneath it. The psyche works spirally, not linearly. Awareness deepens through repetition with difference. During these moments, self-compassion becomes essential. Not indulgence, but understanding. The empath learns to speak to themselves with the same gentleness they once reserved only for others. Research on self-compassion shows that it enhances resilience, reduces anxiety, and supports sustained change. For the empath, self-compassion is revolutionary. Gradually, the empath's life reflects this inner shift. Choices align more closely with values. Energy returns. Joy appears without guilt. There is room for rest without self-criticism. The empath discovers that peace is not the absence of feeling, but the absence of inner war. This is why the comeback is so profound. It is not a return to who the empath was before the wounds. It is an emergence into who they could only become because of them. Psychology consistently observes that post-traumatic growth does not erase trauma. It transforms its impact. The empath's sensitivity, once a source of vulnerability, becomes a refined instrument. Others may now seek the empath's insight, drawn to their clarity. The empath must remain vigilant here. Old patterns can reappear in subtler forms. Giving advice can become a new way to overextend. The empath's task is to share wisdom without assuming responsibility for others' lives. This balance is delicate and requires ongoing awareness. As time moves forward, the empath may sense an expanding sense of self. No, inflated, but spacious. Identity becomes less rigid. They are no longer defined solely by roles or reactions. They can be many things without losing coherence. Depth psychology refers to this as ego flexibility in service of the self. It allows adaptation without fragmentation. Spiritually, this spaciousness often brings humility. The empath recognizes how much remains unknown. Certainty softens into curiosity. Judgment yields to understanding without surrendering discernment. This humility is not self-diminishment, it is realism. It acknowledges complexity without collapsing into confusion. The comeback continues quietly, persistently. There is no final arrival, no permanent state of completion. Integration is ongoing. Yet something irreversible has occurred. The empath can no longer fully abandon themselves. Even when they stumble, awareness remains. This is the true transformation. And so the empath moves forward, not as a martyr, not as a savior, but as a human being who feels deeply and chooses consciously. The world may still be overwhelming at times, others may still suffer, but the empath now meets this reality from a place of grounded presence rather than self-erasure. This presence carries weight. It alters interactions. It reshapes possibilities. The biggest comeback of the empath's life is therefore not measured in external achievements, but in inner sovereignty. It is the moment when empathy and selfhood stop competing and begin cooperating, when sensitivity no longer demands sacrifice, but invites wisdom, when the psyche, long divided, begins to speak with a more unified voice, continuing its work, continuing its unfolding, without fanfare, without conclusion, and without the need to announce its arrival, because the transformation is not finished, and the story is still in motion, still deepening, still revealing what it means to live as an empath who has finally come home to themselves and is still learning, still integrating, still becoming, as the process carries on beyond this moment, open-ended, alive and unresolved, moving forward into whatever comes next without closing the circle or ending the journey. And in that ongoing motion, something subtle yet decisive continues to rearrange itself inside the empath. The inner dialogue that once questioned every impulse now grows quieter, not because doubt has vanished, but because trust has formed. Trust in perception, trust in timing, trust in the fact that not every feeling requires immediate action. This trust is earned slowly through repeated evidence that the empath can survive disappointment without collapsing, can say no without losing love, can be misunderstood without needing to explain themselves into exhaustion. Psychologically, this is the maturation of the observing ego. The empath learns to watch thoughts and emotions arise without being consumed by them. Earlier in life, feelings felt absolute, total, identity-defining. Now they are recognized as movements within the psyche, important, meaningful, but not tyrannical. This shift changes how memory operates as well. Past experiences lose their grip. They can be remembered without being relived. Trauma becomes narrative rather than reenactment. This does not mean the empath becomes emotionally distant. On the contrary, presence deepens. When the empath listens now, they are not scanning for danger or responsibility. They are simply listening. Others feel this difference immediately. They feel seen without being managed, held without being absorbed. There is a grounded stillness that allows others to encounter themselves rather than leaning on the empath to regulate their inner world. Spiritually, this stillness has always been described as strength disguised as softness. It is not the absence of power, but power that no longer needs to prove itself. The empath begins to recognize that their nervous system was once trained to equate intensity with connection. Now, connection is felt through resonance, not urgency, through alignment, not drama. As this inner recalibration continues, the empath's relationship with boundaries becomes almost instinctual. Boundaries are no longer rigid walls erected out of fear, nor porous gates left open out of guilt. They become living membranes, responsive, flexible, and intelligent. Psychological theory describes this as differentiated relatedness, the ability to remain oneself while in relationship. For the empath, this is revolutionary. Old patterns may still attempt to resurface during moments of fatigue or stress. The impulse to overgive, to rescue, to smooth over discomfort can reappear. But now, these impulses are noticed early. They are met with curiosity rather than shame. The empath asks, "What is being activated here?" instead of "What is wrong with me?" This question alone alters the outcome. Over time, the empath begins to experience anger differently. Anger no longer terrifies them as a sign of moral failure or impending abandonment. It becomes information. It signals violated values, crossed boundaries, or unmet needs. Psychological research emphasizes that healthy anger supports self-protection and clarity. The empath's task is not to suppress anger, nor to discharge it impulsively, but to translate it into action that honors the self. This translation is where the comeback becomes visible. Decisions change. The empath chooses environments that support nervous system regulation rather than constant adaptation. They gravitate toward relationships where emotional labor is mutual. They may leave careers, communities, or belief systems that required chronic self-betrayal. From the outside, these changes may seem abrupt. Internally, they have been forming for years. There is often a phase of solitude during this transformation. Not isolation, but chosen aloneness. The empath discovers that solitude no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like restoration. Depth psychology recognizes solitude as essential for integration, allowing unconscious material to surface without external interference. In solitude, the empath hears their own voice clearly, sometimes for the first time. In these quieter periods, the empath may reflect on how their sensitivity was shaped. Early relational dynamics often taught them that attunement was necessary for survival. Reading emotional cues became a form of safety. What once saved them later confined them. Understanding this history does not trap the empath in blame. It releases them into compassion for their younger self. Healing moves faster when the past is understood rather than condemned. As compassion deepens, self-forgiveness follows. Forgiveness for staying too long, for tolerating too much, for not knowing earlier what now seems obvious. Psychology is clear on this point. Insight without self-forgiveness hardens into bitterness. The empath's comeback requires softness toward their own learning curve. This softness extends to spiritual understanding as well. The empath no longer seeks transcendence as an escape from humanity. Instead, spirituality becomes immanent, found within the ordinary, the embodied, the relational. presence while washing dishes, awareness while walking, gratitude without performance. This grounded spirituality stabilizes the psyche rather than splitting it. The empath may also notice a shift in how they experience purpose. Purpose no longer feels like a grand mission to save or awaken others. It feels quieter, more intimate. It is expressed through integrity, consistency, and authenticity. Psychology suggests that meaning rooted in values rather than outcomes is more sustainable. The empath's life becomes meaningful not because of impact alone, but because of alignment. As alignment strengthens, fear of abandonment weakens, not because others will never leave, but because the empath no longer leaves themselves. This internal companionship changes everything. Loss, when it occurs, is painful but not annihilating. Grief is felt fully, but it does not erase identity. The empath learns that endings do not negate what was real. There is also a subtle shift in how the empath relates to authority, external and internal. External authority figures lose their absolute power. The empath respects wisdom without surrendering autonomy. Internally, the harsh inner critic softens. It no longer dominates the psyche. It becomes one voice among many, no longer mistaken for truth itself. This inner democracy allows for playfulness to return. Joy emerges in unexpected moments. Laughter feels less guarded. Creativity flows without the pressure to be useful. Psychology recognizes play as a sign of nervous system safety. For the empath, play signals that survival mode is loosening its grip. As the comeback continues, the empath may attract different kinds of challenges. Instead of being tested through depletion, they are tested through responsibility. Opportunities arise that require leadership, visibility, or decisive action. These can be uncomfortable at first. The empath may worry about becoming too much, too visible, too influential. Old fears of harming others through self-expression may surface. Here, integration is key. Leadership does not require domination. Visibility does not require self-betrayal. Influence does not require manipulation. The empath learns to hold power ethically, guided by awareness rather than guilt. Psychological studies on leadership increasingly emphasize emotional intelligence and self-regulation, qualities the empath possesses in abundance when integrated. There may be moments when the empath looks back and barely recognizes their former self. This can bring sadness, even tenderness. The old self was not weak, they were adaptive. They did what they had to do with what they had. Honoring that version allows the new version to stand without arrogance. The empath's comeback is not linear. There will be days of clarity and days of confusion, days of strength and days of vulnerability. The difference now is context. Vulnerability is no longer interpreted as failure. Confusion is no longer equated with danger. These states are allowed to exist without defining the whole. As years pass, the empath's sensitivity becomes refined rather than raw. They sense subtleties without being overwhelmed. They perceive undercurrents without drowning in them. This refinement is the fruit of long inner work. It cannot be rushed or imitated. It is lived. Others may begin to ask the empath how they changed. The empath may struggle to answer. Words feel insufficient. The truth is that the change was not a single realization, but thousands of small moments of choosing differently, choosing rest over proving, choosing honesty over harmony, choosing self-respect over familiarity. In psychological language, this is the accumulation of corrective experiences. Each time the empath honors themselves and survives, the psyche rewires. Safety is relearned. Trust is rebuilt internally. Over time, these micro-choices create a macro shift. Spiritually, the empath may come to see life as a dialogue rather than a battle. Experiences are no longer interpreted solely as tests or punishments, but as invitations to deepen awareness. This perspective reduces resistance. Acceptance does not mean passivity, it means clarity about what can and cannot be controlled. The empath's relationships continue to evolve. Some deepen, some fall away. New ones form slowly, often grounded in shared values rather than mutual wounds. Intimacy becomes safer because it no longer requires self-abandonment. The empath can be close without dissolving. As the inner world stabilizes, the empath's outer world often reflects this order. Routines emerge, health improves. Finances may stabilize as boundaries around labor and energy solidify. These practical changes are not separate from psychological healing, they are expressions of it. There is also a growing tolerance for complexity. The empath can hold paradox without rushing to resolve it. They can love someone and disagree with them. They can feel sadness and gratitude simultaneously. This capacity marks psychological maturity. It reduces black and white thinking and supports resilience. At this stage, the empath may sense that their life is no longer organized around recovery, but around living. Healing recedes into the background, not because it is finished, but because it is integrated. The empath is no longer constantly looking inward to fix something. They are present with what is. Yet even now the process continues. New layers emerge. New challenges arise. The psyche is not static. Growth does not end. The empath understands this intuitively. There is no rush to arrive, no need to finalize identity. Becoming remains open. And so the empath moves forward, carrying sensitivity as a strength that has been tempered by awareness, shaped by discernment, and grounded in self-trust. They are no longer defined by how much they can endure, but by how truthfully they can live. The comeback unfolds quietly, relentlessly, not as a dramatic return to the world, but as a steady inhabiting of the self, continuing onward, unfinished, unsealed, and still in motion. As the inner journey keeps deepening, unfolding into further understanding, further integration, further becoming, without closure, without a final word, and without drawing a line beneath the story that is still being written from within. This is where the circle finally tightens, not by closing, but by becoming whole. The empath's journey has never been about becoming harder, colder, or less feeling. It has been about becoming real, about learning that depth without direction becomes suffering, and compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. What rises now is not the wounded empath, nor the self-sacrificing one, but the integrated human being who can feel without disappearing, who can love without bleeding, who can stand in truth without needing permission. The comeback was never meant to impress the world. It was meant to restore inner order. It was meant to return authority to the center of the psyche, where intuition and reason meet, where emotion informs rather than rules, and where the self is no longer fragmented by fear or longing. This is the quiet power that changes everything, the ability to remain oneself in the presence of others, in the face of uncertainty, and in the midst of life's inevitable complexity. What emerges is a presence that does not chase validation or resist vulnerability, a presence that understands that sensitivity is not a weakness to be corrected, but a force that must be disciplined, honored, and embodied. The empath no longer lives to absorb the world's pain, nor to prove their worth through endurance. They live to participate consciously, to choose truth over habit, and to let life move through them without losing themselves in it. This is not an ending, it is a stabilization, a moment where the psyche stands upright, no longer split between giving and surviving, no longer torn between love and selfhood. From here, life continues, uncertain, imperfect, and alive, but it is met from a different place, a place of inner coherence, a place where compassion includes the self, a place where the empath no longer asks, "How much can I take?" but instead lives from the deeper question, "How truthfully can I be?" And from that place, everything that follows carries a different weight, a different clarity, and a different kind of strength, one that does not announce itself, but is unmistakable to anyone who feels it.